The heavy double doors swung shut with a final echoing thud, shutting out the noise of the busy city street. Inside, the air instantly changed. It smelled of old wood, beeswax polish, and a faint, dusty scent that seemed to hang around very old places. For 17-year-old Carlos, this smell was the smell of his job. It was the smell of long nights and tired muscles. Carlos stood still for a moment in the grand foyer, listening. Just moments ago, this place had been filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, laughing and talking about the music they had just heard. Now, it was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning system high above in the ceiling. He adjusted the strap of his heavy cleaning cart and began to push it across the marble floor. The wheels made a rhythmic clicking sound that bounced off the high walls. This was the Grand Concert Hall, the most famous building in the city. During the day, or rather, during the evening when the shows happened, it was a place of magic. It was where famous musicians from all over the world came to play. Rich people sat in velvet seats and listened to violins, cellos, and pianos. But Carlos never saw that side of things. By the time his shift started at 9 o'clock, the audience was gone. The musicians had packed up their instruments and left. The bright stage lights were turned off. Carlos was left alone with the empty building. He wasn't a musician. He was a janitor. Carlos pushed his cart through the lower lobby, checking his list on his clipboard. First, he had to vacuum the red carpets. Then he had to clean the glass doors. Finally, he had to mop the main floor. It was repetitive work he could do with his eyes closed, but he tried to be careful. His mother had told him 1,000 times that even a small job like this was important if they wanted to build a new life in this country. He didn't want to let her down. He walked into the main auditorium, and even after 3 months of working here, the size of the room still made him stop and look up. It was huge. Balconies lined the walls, curved like waves, decorated with gold leaf that shone even in the dim light. Thousands of red seats faced the front, all pointing toward the stage-like eyes waiting for something to happen. Carlos sighed and walked down the sloped aisle toward the front. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the steps. He grabbed the large industrial vacuum cleaner from his cart and dragged it down the rows. Vrm. V-R-R-R-M. The noise was loud and annoying, breaking the peaceful silence of the hall. He moved methodically. Row A, row B, row C. He bent down to pick up a dropped program booklet and a crushed popcorn box. People were messy, he thought. They enjoyed the beauty and the music, but they left their trash behind for someone else to clean up. As he worked his way closer to the stage, the feeling in the room changed. It felt heavier here, more serious. The air was cooler. Carlos finished vacuuming the front rows and turned the machine off. The sudden silence rushed back in, pressing against his ears. He walked up the 3 steps that led to the stage floor. The wood here was different from the rest of the building. It was a special, shiny wood that felt smooth under his shoes. In the center of the vast, empty stage, sitting all by itself in a pool of soft blue light coming from the emergency exit sign, was the piano. It was a Steinway. Carlos didn't know everything about pianos, but he knew this was the best kind. It was black and glossy, shaped like a giant wing. It looked heavy, like it weighed as much as a car. The lid was propped open, showing the tight strings inside. Carlos stopped his cart and stood at the edge of the stage looking at it. During the concerts, this piano was the star. The pianist would sit on the bench, dressed in a tuxedo, and the spotlight would hit them. The audience would hold their breath. But now, the piano was just a piece of furniture. It was cold and quiet, waiting for the janitor to wipe it down. He stepped onto the stage and approached the instrument slowly. He took out a soft microfiber cloth from his back pocket. This was part of his routine. He had to polish the lid every night. He wasn't allowed to touch the keys, that was a strict rule. He could clean the wood. He reached out and laid his hand on the smooth surface. It was cool to the touch. He wiped away a small speck of dust, watching the cloth glide over the black finish. As he polished, his eyes drifted to the keyboard. It was covered by a red velvet cloth, but the shape of the keys was unmistakable underneath. He knew that underneath that cloth were 88 black and white keys that could make any sound in the world. A memory flashed through his mind. He remembered being 10 years old, back in the small apartment where he used to live. There was an old, beat-up keyboard in the corner. It was missing 2 keys and made a buzzing sound when you turned it on, but he had loved it. He would spend hours pressing the buttons, teaching himself songs he heard on the radio. He remembered the feeling of his fingers moving, the way the music made the stress of school and homework disappear, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Life had gotten complicated. Money was tight. His father had left, and his mother needed help with the bills. The keyboard was sold to pay for groceries. Music became a luxury he couldn't afford. He had traded the piano for a broom. Carlos shook his head, trying to push the memory away. It didn't do any good to wish for things that couldn't happen. He finished wiping the piano lid, making sure not to leave a single streak. He stepped back to admire his work. The piano shone in the dim light, looking perfect and still. He looked around the massive hall. It was so empty. The rows of seats stretched out into the darkness. It felt lonely, but also peaceful. It felt like a secret world that only he knew about. For a few hours every night, this magnificent building belonged to him. He was the king of this silent castle. He glanced at his watch. It was just past 10:30. He still had the upper balcony to clean, and then the bathrooms. The night was far from over. His back already hurt a little bit, and his hands felt rough from the cleaning chemicals. Carlos sighed again, deeper this time. He turned his back on the piano and grabbed the handle of his cleaning cart. He pushed it off the stage, the wheels bumping slightly over the metal transition strip between the stage and the floor. He didn't look back at the piano as he walked up the side aisle toward the stairs. He had a job to do. As he climbed the stairs to the first balcony, the silence of the hall followed him. The building felt like it was sleeping. But as he reached the top of the stairs and looked down at the stage one last time from the high vantage point, he saw it there. The single grand piano, sitting small and distant in the center of the giant floor. For a second, just a split second, he imagined what it would sound like if he were to sit down and play. Not just a simple tune, but something big. Something that would fill this huge room. He imagined the sound bouncing off the walls and waking up the statues in the lobby. Don't be stupid, he whispered to himself in the dark. He turned on the flashlight attached to his cart and pointed the beam down the long, narrow hallway of the balcony. It was time to get back to work. The fantasy was over. The music was for the people who paid for tickets. The cleaning was for him. Carlos began to vacuum the balcony carpet. The noise of the machine filling the hall once again, drowning out the silence that seemed to be calling to him. He was just a teenager with a broom, and the piano was just an object. At least that's what he told himself as he worked through the night, trying very hard not to listen to the quiet voice inside his heart that remembered how to play. The weeks began to blur together, creating a rhythm that was as steady and predictable as the ticking of a clock. Carlos would arrive at the concert hall exactly at 9 o'clock, change into his gray uniform, and begin his rounds. The novelty of working in such a beautiful place wore off, replaced by the reality of the hard work. His feet ached constantly from standing on the concrete floors, and the smell of the cleaning chemicals seemed to cling to his skin no matter how long he showered. But he was grateful. The money was enough to help his mother pay the rent, and for now, that was all that mattered. During these weeks, Carlos developed a silent routine with the piano. It became the highlight of his shift, a secret moment that belonged only to him, even though he never played a single note. Every night, after he finished sweeping the main floor and cleaning the glass doors, he would walk down the center aisle toward the stage. He would drag his heavy cleaning cart behind him, leaving it parked in the wings while he stepped out. Onto the polished wood, the stage was different from the rest of the building. It felt sacred. When he walked out there, he felt a change in the air, like he was stepping into a church or a library where speaking above a whisper was a crime. He would approach the Steinway with his soft yellow cloth in hand. He would wipe the lid, removing the invisible dust that had settled since the night before. Then he would carefully polish the curved legs and the sides. This was the only time he allowed himself to stop moving. For 5 minutes, maybe 10, he he would stand there and look at the instrument. Up close, he could see the details he missed from the audience seats. He could see his own reflection in the glossy black paint, distorted and dark. He could see the intricate gold lettering on the side. That spelled out the name of the maker. But the most tempting part was the keyboard. It was usually closed by a heavy wooden fallboard, hiding the keys from view. Sometimes, however, the piano tuner would come in during the day, and occasionally he would leave the fallboard open. On those nights, Carlos would stand before the piano and stare at the keys. They were white as bone and black as coal, waiting for fingers to bring them to life. He would clench his hands into fists in his pockets. He could feel the rough calluses on his fingertips, earned from scrubbing floors and handling heavy equipment. He remembered how his hands used to look when he played the old keyboard at home fast, light and full of energy. Now his hands felt clumsy and stiff. Don't touch it, he would tell himself. It wasn't just a rule. It was a fear. He knew that if his boss, a strict man who walked through the halls with a clipboard and a frown, ever caught him touching the keys, he would lose his job instantly. And he couldn't afford to lose his job. His mother relied on him. His younger sister needed school supplies. The risk was too high. The piano was worth more than he would make in 10 years. He was just a janitor. He didn't belong on that bench. One rainy Tuesday, the atmosphere in the hall felt heavier than usual. The storm outside battered the high roof with a sound like distant drums. Thunder rattled the windows, making the old building creak and groan. Carlos was tired. He had a math test the next day that he wasn't prepared for, and his mother had been worrying about the heating bill at home. The stress sat like a heavy stone in his chest. He finished his work in the lobby and pushed his cart toward the auditorium. The lights were set lower than normal, casting long, spooky shadows across the seats. The building felt empty and vast. Carlos felt very small in the middle of it. He walked down the aisle and stepped onto the stage. There it was, the piano. Tonight, the fallboard was open. The keys seemed to glow in the dim light. Carlos took his cloth and began to polish the lid. He moved the cloth in slow circles. Rub, rub, rub. The sound was soothing. When he finished the lid, he moved to the side. He polished the legs. Rub, rub, rub. Finally, there was nothing left to clean. The piano was perfect. He stood up straight and sighed. He should go. He still had to scrub the floors in the bathrooms before he could leave. But his feet wouldn't move. He looked at the keys. They were right there, inches away. Just one, he whispered to the empty room. He looked around sharply, his heart jumping. He checked the exits. He checked the shadows in the wings. The security cameras were tucked away in the corners, their small red lights blinking. He knew they were there, watching him. He knew that somewhere in a small office, a security guard was staring at a monitor, but the urge was stronger tonight. The stress of the week, the memories of the music he used to love, the feeling of being invisible lit, all swirled together inside him. He felt a desperate need to hear a sound that wasn't a vacuum cleaner or a floor buffer. He wanted to hear something beautiful. He slowly reached out his hand. His fingers trembled slightly. He hovered his hand over the keys, afraid to make contact. He looked at the camera again. He imagined the alarm bells ringing. He imagined the angry voice of his boss. He imagined coming home and telling his mother he was fired because he couldn't follow a simple rule. Carlos pulled his hand back quickly, as if the keys were on fire. He felt a flush of shame rise to his cheeks. What was he thinking? He wasn't a concert pianist. He was a 17-year-old kid with a dirty uniform. This piano wasn't for him. It was for the geniuses, the prodigies, the people with talent and money. He had no right to touch it. He grabbed the handle of his cleaning cart with more force than necessary. The metal clanged loudly. The sound echoed through the hall, mocking him. He turned his back on the piano, not looking at it, not even glancing at the open keyboard. He pushed the cart off the stage, his sneakers squeaking against the wood. He walked quickly up the aisle, escaping the stage as if it were pulling him in. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the back hallway where the air smelled of mop water and disinfectant. He leaned against the cold concrete wall and took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He was being foolish, he told himself. Dreaming was for people with time to dream. He had work to do. He had a family to feed. He pushed the image of the piano out of his mind and headed for the supply closet to get the mop. But even as he scrubbed the sticky floor of the men's restroom, the image of the black and white keys stayed burned in the back of his mind. He could almost feel the ghostly sensation of the keys under his fingertips, a phantom touch that wouldn't go away. He knew he shouldn't, but deep down, he also knew that he couldn't ignore the feeling forever. The music was inside him, waiting to come out, and the silence of the concert hall was getting louder every night. The storm outside had been raging for over an hour, turning the city streets into a mess of water and wind. Inside the concert hall, the weather was creating its own kind of chaos. Usually the building hummed with the quiet sound of electricity and air conditioning. But tonight, the lights were flickering. Every few minutes, the grand chandelier in the lobby would dim and then flare back up. Making the shadows in the room dance like living things, Carlos was in the middle of polishing the brass railings near the entrance when the power cut out completely. For a second, everything went pitch black. The silence was sudden and terrifying, broken only by the sound of the rain hammering against the high roof. Carlos froze, his hands still gripping the railing. He waited, counting his heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Then, with a low click, the emergency lights kicked on. They weren't bright like the normal lights. They were small, dull boxes, placed near the floor along the walls. They cast a spooky yellowish glow that made the huge lobby look like a cavern. Carlos looked around. The security cameras usually whirred quietly as they moved from side to side, scanning the room. He looked up at the camera in the corner. The small red light was off. He walked over to the security booth at the front entrance. The older guard who usually sat there watching the monitors was gone. On the desk, there was a note scribbled on a piece of paper. Asterisk storm damage. System down. Generator running lights only. Back in 30 Mines, Asterisk Carlos stared at the note. The cameras were down. The guard was gone. The building was empty, save for him. A shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. He felt a sudden, intense sense of freedom. It was a scary feeling, like standing on the edge of a cliff, but it was also exciting. He walked back into the main auditorium. The emergency lighting here was even more dramatic. Along the aisles, small lights glowed, leading the way down to the stage like a path of fireflies. At the front of the room, a single large emergency light above the stage bathed the piano in a weak, ethereal blue beam. It looked lonely. It looked like it was waiting. Carlos stood at the back of the hall for a long time. He looked at the exit doors. He could leave. He could go home, tell his boss that the power went out and he couldn't finish the cleaning. But his feet felt like they were glued to the carpet. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. He took a step forward, then another. He walked slowly down the center aisle, not pushing his cart this time. He left it behind in the shadows. The air around him felt charged with electricity. The silence of the hall wasn't heavy anymore. It was expectant. It felt like the building was holding its breath. When he reached the stage, he climbed the 3 steps. The wood felt cool under his sneakers. He walked until he was standing right in front of the piano. Up close, it looked majestic. The blue light reflected off the black surface, making it look deep and mysterious. Carlos reached out with a shaking hand. He touched the fallboard, the wooden cover that hid the keys. It was smooth. He pushed it gently. It slid back into the piano with a soft thunk. There they were, the 88 keys. They looked so innocent, just pieces of ivory and ebony attached to wood. But Carlos knew they held the power to make thunder, to make weeping, to make joy. He stared at them. He sat down on the bench. It was firm and comfortable. He placed his hands on his knees. He was shaking. He looked over his shoulder at the dark auditorium. The thousands of red seats were hidden in the shadows facing him. It felt like an audience of ghosts was watching. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty room. He didn't know who he was. Apologizing maybe to his boss, maybe to his mother, maybe to himself. He took a deep breath. He lifted his hands. They hovered over the keys for a moment, trembling in the blue light. He closed his eyes and remembered the song he used to love. It was a piece by a composer he had learned years ago, a song that was sad, but full of hope. He remembered the first note. His right index finger came down. C. The sound was clear and pure, ringing out in the silence. It was shockingly loud. The note floated up into the high ceiling of the hall, swirling around in the darkness. Carlos froze. He waited for an alarm to ring. He waited for a guard to shout, but nothing happened. The note faded away, echoing softly until it disappeared. Carlos opened his eyes. He looked at the keys. They hadn't bitten him. The world hadn't ended. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He placed his hand properly on the keys, his fingers curling naturally. He wasn't Carlos the janitor anymore. In this blue light, with the storm raging outside, he was just a boy and a piano. He began to play. At first his fingers were stiff and unsure. It had been a long time. He missed a few notes, the sound clashing awkwardly in the quiet hall. He frowned, frustrated with himself. But then he stopped thinking. He stopped worrying about the dirt on the floor or the money he needed to earn. He let his muscles remember. His fingers found the rhythm. The melody began to flow. It started slow, a simple tune that wandered through the lower notes of the piano. Then his left hand joined in, adding a deep, steady bass. The sound filled the stage. It was incredible. The acoustics of the hall, designed to catch the whisper of a violin, grabbed the piano music and threw it back at him. He was surrounded by the sound. He played louder. The sadness he had been carrying for weeks, the tiredness, the worry, the feeling of being invisible, poured out of his hands and into the strings. The music swelled. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a voice. It was shouting what he couldn't say. The notes raced up the keyboard fast and bright, like rain running down a window pane. Carlos lost track of time. He didn't see the darkness of the room. He didn't feel the cold air. He only saw the music in his mind. He remembered the old keyboard in his childhood room. He remembered the way his mother used to smile when he played for her before life got hard. He played for her. He played for the silence. He played because he could not play. The song reached its climax. His hands were flying across the keys, striking them with a power he didn't know he had. The music was thundering now, matching the storm outside. The grand piano was vibrating against his back, the wood coming alive in response to his touch. He felt like he was flying, weightless and free. Then, slowly, the song began to quiet down. The storm of notes passed. He played softer, gentler. The melody drifted back down to the deep, resonant bass notes. He played the final chord. C, gig. He held his hands down on the keys, letting the sound ring out. The chord hung in the air of the concert hall, beautiful and full. It faded slowly, echoing off the distant walls, until it was just a whisper. And then silence returned to the room. Carlos sat there, breathing hard. His chest was heaving and sweat was on his forehead. He slowly lifted his hands off the keys. The silence that came back was different than before. It wasn't empty. It was satisfied. He stared at his fingers. They were trembling, but now it was from the exertion, not the fear. He looked out into the vast, dark hall. He felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. The weight on his chest was gone. For a few minutes, the world had been perfect. He closed the fallboard gently, covering the keys again. He stood up from the bench, his legs feeling a little weak. He knew he had to go back. He had to get his cart and finish cleaning. He had to be the janitor again. But he also knew that something had changed. The piano wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore, and he wasn't just a janitor. They were connected now. He had woken the hall up, and the hall had listened to him. As the final vibrations of the piano faded into the darkness, a profound silence settled over the concert hall. It was a heavy, thick silence, much heavier than the one that had been there before. Carlos sat on the bench for a long moment, his hands resting on his knees, his heart slowly coming down from its racing rhythm. He felt drained, but in a good way, like he had just run a marathon or lifted a heavy weight that had been crushing him for months. The music had let the air out of the balloon of his stress. He took a deep, shaky breath and looked around. The emergency lights were still casting their spooky blue glow, but the hall didn't look scary anymore. It looked welcoming. The thousands of empty seats didn't feel like eyes judging him anymore. They felt like friends who had come to listen. The gold on the walls seemed to shimmer a little brighter, catching the faint light. For the first time since he started working there, Carlos felt like the hall was actually his. He stood up slowly, his legs feeling a little wobbly. He looked down at the piano. The fallboard was still open, revealing the keys that had just spoken so loudly. He felt a sudden urge to play again, to lose himself in the music for another hour, but he knew he couldn't. The power could come back on any minute. The cameras could flicker to life. The security guard could return. He had already taken a huge risk. He needed to get back to work before he got caught. Carlos reached out and gently lowered the fallboard, hiding the keys again. Click. The sound was soft, but it sounded like a door closing on a secret world. He gave the piano lid one last wipe with his sleeve, just to make sure there were no fingerprints left behind. And turned to leave the stage, he walked down the stairs and into the orchestra pit, heading toward the aisle where he had left his cleaning cart. As he walked, the echo of his own footsteps was the only sound. He grabbed the handle of the cart and began to push it toward the back of the hall. He had intended to go to the lobby to finish polishing the brass, but something stopped him. He felt weird, exposed. The adrenaline that had given him the courage to play was wearing off. Leaving him feeling jittery, he decided to take the long way around to the lobby. Walking through the side hallway that ran along the wall of the auditorium, it was darker there, away from the blue lights of the stage. As he pushed his cart, the squeak of the wheels echoed loudly in the narrow space. He kept his head down, staring at the floor, trying to make himself as small as possible. He felt like a thief who had just stolen a diamond. Even though all he had stolen was a moment of time, he was about halfway. Down the hall, when he stopped, there was a sound. At first he thought it was just the storm outside. The wind was still howling, rattling the windows. He listened hard, holding his breath. Squeak, no, that wasn't the wind. That was a shoe. A shoe on a concrete floor? Carlos froze. His hands gripped the handle of the cart until his knuckles turned white. He turned his head slowly, looking back into the darkness he had just walked through. From the shadows at the end of the hall, near the heavy double doors that led to the administration offices, a figure emerged. It was just a silhouette in the dim light, but Carlos recognized the shape immediately. It was a man. He was wearing a long coat and holding a briefcase. Panic exploded in Carlos's chest. It was the manager, the man who hired him, the man who walked around with a clipboard and fired people for being 5 minutes late, the man who had made it very clear on Carlos's first day that the piano is not to be touched under any circumstances. The manager walked slowly toward Carlos. He didn't say a word. The only sound was the tapping of his dress shoes on the floor. Tap, tap, tap. Each step felt like a hammer hitting Carlos in the stomach. Carlos's mind raced. He should run. He should pretend he was cleaning. He should say he was just checking the doors. But his feet were glued to the floor. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He just stood there, gripping his cleaning cart, waiting for the shouting to start. He imagined being fired. He imagined his mother crying. He imagined having to go back to his home country with nothing. The fear choked him. The manager stopped a few feet away. He was older, with gray hair and glasses that reflected the emergency light. He looked at Carlos, then at the cart, then back toward the stage. "I thought I heard something," the manager said. His voice was calm, not angry. It was a quiet voice that matched the silence of the hall. Carlos swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. "I was just cleaning, sir," he stammered. His voice cracked, sounding small and pathetic in the big space. The power went out, and the manager held up a hand to stop him. He wasn't looking at Carlos's face. He was looking toward the stage door. "I came back from my phone," he said. "Left it in the office. When I walked in, the power was out. I was standing in the back vestibule. In the dark, Carlos closed his eyes for a second. The back vestibule. That was directly behind the last row of seats. The manager had been there. He had been in the building. While Carlos was playing, Carlos felt his face turn hot with shame. He had been caught red-handed. Not just touching the piano, but playing it. Playing it badly, probably. Making a fool of himself in front of the man who owned the building. Carlos blurted out, the words rushing out of him. I know I'm not supposed to touch it. I know the rules. I promise I will never do it again. Please don't fire me. My mom needs the money. I was cleaning it, and the lid was open, and I'm sorry. He bowed his head, staring at the manager's shoes, waiting for the lecture. He waited for the man to say, pack your things. He waited for the anger, but the silence stretched on. The manager didn't yell. He didn't move toward the door. He just stood there. Finally, the manager spoke. Chopin. Carlos blinked. He looked up, confused. What? The piece you were playing, the manager said, his face still serious. It was Chopin. The Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. It's a very famous piece. Carlos stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected the manager to know the music. He certainly hadn't expected the manager to sound like he actually listened to it. I didn't know the name, Carlos whispered. I just heard it a long time ago. I memorized it. The manager adjusted his glasses. He looked at Carlos with a new expression. It wasn't the look he gave to janitors or cleaning staff. It was a look of curiosity. He stepped closer, invading Carlos's personal space slightly. He looked deep into the young man's eyes. You have a very light touch, the manager said. Most people, when they play that instrument, they pound on it. They treat it like a percussion instrument. But you were caressing it. The sound was gentle. Even in the darkness, I could feel the emotion. You play with a lot of sadness, son, but there is beauty in it. Carlos felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. He didn't know what to do with this compliment. It didn't fit. He was a janitor. He scrubbed floors. He wasn't supposed to be told his playing was beautiful. I haven't played in a long time, Carlos admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I don't have a piano anymore. The manager nodded slowly. He looked back at the dark stage. It is a crime for talent like that to go silent, he said softly. He looked back at Carlos. I've heard a lot of people play this hall. Professionals, students, people with degrees from fancy music schools. And let me tell you, most of them don't have the raw emotion you showed in there tonight. They have the technique, but they don't have the heart. Carlos stared at him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This had to be a dream. The storm outside, the darkness, the sudden kindness of the boss. It felt surreal. I won't tell anyone, the manager said suddenly. What you did tonight. Breaking the rules. It stays between us. I won't fire you. Carlos let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for his entire life. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you so much, sir. But, the manager continued, raising a finger. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They jingled softly in the quiet hall. I can't have a ghost playing my piano in the dark. It's a waste. He held the keys out to Carlos. Carlos looked at them, then at the manager, unsure of what was happening. Take these, the manager said. This is a key to the backstage service entrance, and a key to the piano lid lock. I don't want you sneaking around anymore. I don't want you playing only when the power is out and the cameras are down. Carlos's hand trembled as he reached out and took the keys. The metal was cold. What? What do you want me to do, sir? I want you to practice, the manager said, a small smile finally appearing on his serious face. I finish my paperwork at 10 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When I leave, you are allowed to stay. You can turn the stage lights on. You can play for an hour. But you have to promise me something. Anything, Carlos said. You have to get better, the manager said firmly. You have a gift, Carlos. Don't waste it on scrubbing floors forever. Music is a hard life, but it's a good life. And this hall, it misses the music when the audience goes home. It needs someone to bring it to life. I think that person is you. Carlos stood there, clutching the keys, his heart pounding with a completely new kind of feeling. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was hope. Pure, bright hope. I promise, Carlos said, his voice stronger now. The manager nodded once. Good. Now, get back to work. And wash your hands before you touch my brass railings. You have dust on your fingers? He turned and walked away down the dark hallway, his shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the floor. Carlos stood alone in the shadows, the keys tight in his fist. He looked back toward the stage. The darkness didn't seem so heavy anymore. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting for him to come back. And for the first time in his life, he had a key to unlock it. Asterisk, the weeks that followed that stormy night were the happiest of Carlos's life. Everything changed. Yet nothing really changed on the surface. He still put on his gray uniform every evening. He still pushed his heavy cart through the echoing halls. He still scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. But the weight he used to carry on his shoulders was gone. He walked differently now, with his head held high and a little bit of a bounce in his step. He had a secret. But it wasn't a heavy, guilty secret anymore. It was a golden, exciting secret. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, exactly at 10 o'clock, the manager would walk past him, give a small nod, and leave through the front doors. As soon as the coast was clear, Carlos would drop his mop. He would run to the stage, but not in the shadows this time. He would go to the light panel and flip the switch. The stage lights would come on. They weren't just the dim blue emergency lights. They were the bright, warm spotlights used for the concerts. Carlos would sit on the bench, blinking in the brightness, and play. For 1 hour, the empty concert hall was filled with music. He practiced hard. His fingers, which had been stiff and rusty, grew strong and fast again. He played the sad songs he loved, but he also started learning new, harder pieces. He challenged himself. Sometimes he would make mistakes, and the sound would clang in the empty room, but he didn't stop. He would just take a deep breath and play the phrase again. The hall became his teacher. He learned how to play softly so the sound would drift like a whisper to the back rows. He learned how to play loudly so the walls vibrated with power. He learned that the piano had a voice, and he was learning how to make it speak. He wasn't just pressing buttons anymore. He was telling stories, but playing alone in an empty hall, even with the lights on, was only half the dream. Carlos knew he was getting better, but he didn't know if he was good enough. He played for the dust and the velvet seats, but he wondered what it would be like to play for real people. One afternoon, about 2 months after the night of the storm, Carlos came in for his shift like usual. But something was different. The building was buzzing with energy. There were extra crew members running around with cables and ladders. The manager was in the lobby, looking stressed, shouting orders into a headset.
Move the podium.
Check the microphones. We have 20 minutes. Carlos stood by his cart, watching. Is there a show tonight, sir? He asked, trying to stay out of the way. The manager looked at him, wiping sweat from his forehead. Yes, but not the one we planned. The high school choir that was supposed to perform tonight, their bus broke down 2 towns away. They aren't coming. The doors open in 30 minutes, and we have 200 people out there expecting a show. Carlos's eyes went wide. What are you going to do? I have to go out there and give them a refund, the manager said, looking defeated. It's a nightmare. It's bad for business, and people will be angry. Turned to walk away, but then he stopped. He looked at Carlos. He looked at the boy standing in his janitor's uniform, holding a broom. He looked at the hands that had been scrubbing the floors of this building for months. Then he looked at the stage. A strange look came over the manager's face. It was a look of madness, perhaps, or maybe it was a look of genius. Carlos, he said quietly. Yes, sir. How is your Beethoven? Carlos froze. My, what? Beethoven. The Moonlight Sonata. Can you play it? I think so. I've been working on it. I'm not perfect at the fast part yet, but... The manager didn't wait for him to finish. He grabbed Carlos by the shoulder and steered him toward the stage. You are going to play. What? Carlos tried to pull back. No, sir. I can't. I'm not a professional. I'm the janitor. People will laugh. I can't go out there. You play this piano every night, the manager said firmly. I hear you from my office. You have the heart. That is what people pay for. They want to feel something. You are going to go out there, and you are going to play. I don't have a suit, Carlos stammered. I look like a cleaner. The manager looked at his gray uniform. You look like a man who works hard, he said. Take off your tie. Unbutton the top button of your shirt. Roll up your sleeves. Let them see who you are. Before Carlos could argue, the manager was pushing him up the stairs to the stage. He sat Carlos down on the bench. I will introduce you. I will tell them the truth. That you work here. That you are a local talent. They will love you. Just don't stop playing. The manager ran to the side of the stage. Carlos sat alone. The stage lights were blindingly bright. He couldn't see the audience, but he could hear them. The murmur of 200 people talking, the shuffling of feet, the coughing. It was a terrifying sound. His hands were shaking so much he couldn't keep them still. Ladies and gentlemen, the manager's voice boomed over the speaker system. We have a change in program. Our featured act cannot be here tonight. But I am pleased to announce that we have a very special last-minute replacement. He is a young man who works here at the hall. Please welcome Carlos. A confused silence. Then, a polite smattering of applause. Carlos took a deep breath. He felt like he might throw up. He looked out into the darkness beyond the lights. He couldn't see faces, only a vast, black void. But then he remembered the storm. He remembered the feeling of the keys under his fingers when he thought no one was listening. He remembered the feeling of being free. He placed his shaking hands on the keys. He started the first notes of the Moonlight Sonata. The beginning is slow, deep, and sad. The sound rang out, clear and pure. The murmuring in the audience stopped instantly. The hall became silent. Carlos closed his eyes. He blocked out the lights. He blocked out his fear. He pretended he was alone on a stormy night. He let the music take over. The notes flowed from his fingers, moving through the slow, haunting melody as he played. He felt the atmosphere in the room change. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was attention. He could feel hundreds of people leaning forward in their seats. He could feel them holding their breath. They weren't judging his gray uniform. They weren't laughing at the janitor. They were listening. He played through the slow movement, his heart calming down. His fingers found their rhythm. He poured his story into the music, the hard work, the missed opportunities, the secret dreams. He played for his mother and for the little boy he used to be. When he reached the faster, more agitated part of the song, his fingers flew. He made a few mistakes, notes that weren't perfect, but he didn't stop. He kept going, pushing the tempo, playing with passion and fire. The sound was huge, filling the massive space, and then the end. The final, descending notes. He played the last chord with all his strength, then let his hands drop to his lap. For a second, there was total silence. Carlos sat there, terrified again. Had they hated it? Then, a single person clapped. Then another. Then suddenly the whole room erupted. The applause was like thunder. It was louder than the rain, louder than the vacuum cleaner. It was a wall of sound coming at him from the darkness. People were standing up. Carlos could see silhouettes rising in the front rows. He saw a handkerchief waving in the air. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Carlos sat there, stunned. He looked to the side of the stage. The manager was standing there, clapping and smiling. Carlos stood up. He walked to the front of the stage. He looked out at the lights. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel them. He bowed deeply. He walked off the stage, his legs feeling like jelly. The manager hugged him. "See?" he said. "I told you. They didn't care about the uniform. They cared about the music." That night was the beginning of a new chapter. It wasn't a fairy tale where Carlos became famous overnight. He still had to wake up the next morning and go to school. He still had to work his shifts on the weekends. But everything was different. The manager kept his word. He let Carlos use the hall whenever he wanted. But he didn't stop there. He introduced Carlos to a retired music teacher who agreed to give him lessons for free, in exchange for Carlos helping her around her house. A few months later, the manager helped Carlos apply for a music scholarship at the city university. It was a big deal. Carlos had to write an essay and play in front of a serious panel of judges. He was nervous, but when he sat down to play, he remembered the night of the storm. He remembered the empty hall coming alive. He played his heart out. A week later, he got the letter. He had won the scholarship. It would pay for his books and his tuition. On his last day of work at the concert hall, Carlos didn't want to leave. He walked through the lobby one last time, pushing his empty cart. He looked at the chandeliers and the marble floors. He looked at the doors that led to the auditorium. He walked onto the stage and sat at the piano. He didn't play a song this time. He just sat there. He remembered the boy who used to look at this instrument with fear and longing, afraid to even touch it. He realized now that the fear had been holding him back, but the music had set him free. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He was a musician. Carlos stood up, kissed the top of the piano, and walked off the stage. He left his uniform in the locker. He walked out the heavy double doors and into the bright sunshine of the city. The city was noisy and chaotic, but he walked with a quiet confidence. He knew that no matter how hard life got, he would always have the music, and that was enough.